Hey, hey, so how are y'all doing? I'm sick of this COVID-19. Okay, we just got through covering the principles of design, and now we're going to start talking about the different fine arts media. So the first one that we're going to talk about is drawing. So before we get into that, what do I mean by media or medium? So in terms of art, when you talk about medium, that's any material you use to make a work of art. So that could be like oil on canvas or a bronze sculpture or a clay pot or like graphite or pencil on paper, etc., etc., etc. So the when we talk about it singularly, which I always have a hard time pronouncing, it's known as medium. But when we talk about multiple art materials, it's known as media. But there's also another way we use those two terms. So the word medium, when we're talking about painting, that's the liquid that's added to paint that makes it easier to manipulate. For example, with watercolor, you would add water. And then with acrylic, there's all sorts of different things. You could add water, you could add gel medium, you could add matte medium. There's other things you can add, and it just kind of makes the paint manipulate easier. And for those of you who use acrylic, um, there there are these different kind of mediums called, I believe it's called like slow aid or acrylic retarder. And when you add a little bit of that to your water, it helps make that acrylic not so glumpy, which a lot of times it is. And then with oil paint, you can add linseed oil or turpentine, or there's a million different things, none of which I can think of right now. So drawing, that is the oldest medium. And people have been drawing since they could hold something in their hand. Like this, and the thing about drawing is when we look at images that people drew, regardless of whether or not they drew them yesterday or they drew them 30,000 years ago or 75,000 years ago, and regardless of whether they live right next door to you or across the world, the cool thing is we look at those drawings and we generally can figure out what we're looking at. Like we know that when we're looking at this like 7,000 BCE image on the right, we know that's a kangaroo. And then we look at the one on the left, we may not know it's a woolly mammoth, but we know it's an elephant. So the earliest known drawing was created by somebody in South Africa 73,000 years ago. And it's a really, really simple drawing, but it's someone, and it may have meant something. We don't know that, but someone's making marks on the surface, and that's essentially what it is when you're drawing. I think I talked about the marginalia that bored monks would make, but like everybody doodles, everybody draws, everybody, like, I'm sure when I'm talking in class, a lot of you doodle, otherwise you'd pass out. So all visual artists, including architects, they produce drawings, and they produce them for a number of reasons. Sometimes they're doing a drawing, a preparatory sketch. It's not going to be their final product, but they're sketching out their idea. Inventors do this too. So then there's your final product where you're doing a drawing and you intend it to be the finished piece. People draw to invent or improve upon the inventions of others. People draw, like when my dad went to medical school, and they still require them to do this, they would require them to do drawings so that they could better understand nature and the physiological changes and blood flow, which is a physiological change, all sorts of things. So they would have to do drawings, which would help them better grasp concepts. Like you can look at an image in a book, but when you're asked to draw it and look at the real thing, it helps you understand it a whole lot better. And then like artists like also draw to better understand, and scientists and inventors to understand and record movement. So we're going to talk about some of these ways of drawing. So on the right, we have St. Peter's of Rome. But before we could get to that building, somebody, and in this case, a whole bunch of somebodies, had to figure out the plans of the building. So with St. Peter's, like people weren't really good at building domes back then. And it took over 100 years and 6 architects to figure out how to get that dome so it was structurally sound and didn't collapse. People like artists, they do preparatory sketches before they can make a sculpture. So I'm going to tell you a story about Leonardo da Vinci, but it took 500 years before this drawing of the horse sculpture turned into this actual horse sculpture. So Leonardo da Vinci, here he is, right here. So back then artists, like they had to have patrons, and then they had to have wealthy patrons or else they couldn't make a living. So he'd already had some wealthy patrons, and he got in touch with the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, and asked him if he could work for him. And the Duke said, yeah, sure, you got a good reputation. And the Duke said, my father, Francisco, died, and I want you to design a statue of him on a horse in his honor. So Leonardo said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. I'll be happy to. But Leonardo, like, there's a couple of things that held him up. One is because not only did he have to do the sculpture of a horse, like he had to work on like military armaments and structures and all sorts of different commissions. But also the other issue is that Leonardo was a perfectionist. He procrastinated. It took him forever to do anything. So 11 years after Ludovico asked him to design this, he presented him with a 24-foot model of the statue. Look at this little tiny guy here. The model of the statue in honor of Ludovico's daughter, Bianca's wedding. She's probably like 14 when she's getting married. Now, this isn't the actual model. The actual model, like, is destroyed, but somebody like reproduced it. And then they thought it was really clever that they stuck this tiny guy down here to show how big it was, to show the scale of the statue in relationship to the people that surround it. Remember when we talked about scale? Okay, so then Milan got like invaded and attacked by France. So that statue of that horse, we saw the clay reproduction of it, but the statue is going to be cast in bronze. So the bronze that was supposed to be used for the statue got melted down to make cannons for the people in Milan and their war against France. And also, like the statue, like big clay statue, people used it for target practice, and they shot cannons and arrows, and in the early form of a gun, the Arquebusser, which didn't work very well, into the horse. So Leonardo, here is over here. He also plays soccer. He flees the city. There you go. There's people using it as target practice. So then like 500 years later, this guy, Charles Dent down here, he decides that he's gonna like make the sculpture, and he makes little models of it, and people called it, guess what they called it? Charlie's horse. So if you have a horse throat, they call it a Charlie horse. I think that's what it is. But that was named after this guy, Charles. So Charlie horse, but then he dies. So then the next step is this Talix Art Foundry. They decide that they're going to take it over. And at first they just try to use like some of the people that work for them, and they're not doing a very good job of it. So they hire this woman who's really famous for doing animal sculptures. Her name is Nina Akamu, and she completes it. She's got like all these people working for her. I think it's something like, listen, it's either 6 or 60 people are working for her, and they finish it. And in 1999, they install it and dedicate it in a plaza in Milan. So it's like 500 years to get this fame, but it doesn't have Ludovico's father on the back. It's just the horse. So it takes all this time to get the statue done. So now before I talk about drawing, I'm gonna talk to you about how people learned how to draw and how the entire like artists and craftsmen system worked. So back hundreds, thousands of years ago, if you wanted to be an artist, you apprenticed with somebody who's already a master at it. And this apprenticeship system developed in ancient Egypt and Babylon. And so I think I talked about this a little bit in class, but young artists, like a lot of times that the artists or their family would have to pay the master artist for that young artist to apprentice with them. It's kind of like going to college. Like somebody's having to pay for you to go to college. And then you're studying under somebody who should anyway know what they're talking about, know the subject really well. So so artists would apprentice with these master artists, and then after a while, like different like forms of art, different crafts, they set up these craft guilds. So like the jewelers would all be in a guild, the goldsmiths would all be in a guild, the painters, they'd be in a guild. And so you had to go through these stages, kind of like going to undergraduate or maybe like community college, and then to college, and then like graduate school. So like first you start out as an apprentice, and that could be anywhere from 2 to 9 years, depending on how complicated the work was and how sharp you were. And then once you finish your apprenticeship, then you became a journeyman. You were paid daily. So a lot of times these journeymen would work for master artists, but they couldn't graduate to become a master artist until they themselves had produced a masterpiece. I don't know how they figure that out. I'm going to look it up one day, but today I don't have time. So another thing, if you were going to draw back then, it's not like you could just go to the art supply store or the Office Max and get like a ream of paper. Paper was so super expensive to make. Like they made it out of linen, they made it out of cotton, like all sorts of stuff, and it took forever to make a sheet of paper. What you would do, I took a paper making course one time, I really loved it, is they would have a big old vat of water, and then they would shred up the the linen or the cotton or whatever it is that the paper is going to be made out of. And then you had this frame that was screen, like a window screen. And you like submerged that frame screen into the water and kind of like moved it back and forth. I wish you could see me, but then again, I'm glad you can't. Move it back and forth, and then they'd slowly lift it out of the water, and there would be like a thin layer of the linen or cotton, and later they used wood pulp on the frame. Then they'd have to take that frame, and then they would have to like put a piece of felt on top of it, and then they'd stack a whole bunch of these. Well, they wouldn't take the frame, they would like flip the paper onto the piece of felt. Then they'd stack a bunch of these pieces of felt and put it in this press that screws around, and it screws out all the excess moisture, and then take them out of there and let them dry. So it's taken you forever. And also, before they use that kind of paper, they would use skin of an not undead, it's not like the Walking Dead, skin of a unborn calf or an unborn goat or sheep, and then they would use it and dry it out, or they would use, that would be, if I'm correct, I believe that is vellum, and then they would also use the skin of a live cow or goat or sheep, and then they would have to scrape all the hairs off of it. Then they'd have to pound it out and dry it in the skin, and that was known as parchment. But maybe I'm getting the two mixed up, and I'm really apologize about that. So paper is hard to make. So if you had like this young apprentice that couldn't draw a stick, you're not going to hand him a piece of paper. You're going to hand him a piece of slate or a piece of wood that has got like a gesso over it. So if the kid's drawn on a piece of slate, you can draw on it with chalk and then you can erase it. Or if he's drawn on that piece of wood, you can draw on it and then you can sand it down. So they're not going to hand paper over to this kid. So here's another thing. Back then, like not just anybody could study things like rhetoric or mathematics or music or how to be like how to debate or things like that. You had to be well enough to do. How's that for a term? You had to be well to do, and you had to be like a free person also, well-to-do and a free person, in order to study these things. So the things you could study, like mathematics and not English, mathematics and rhetoric and writing and stuff like that, those were called the liberal arts. But if you were somebody like, not, no offense, but probably the majority of us who at that time were either enslaved or incredibly poor, you could study the mechanical arts. If you were lucky, you could learn how to be a brick mason or like a builder, or you could learn, like you were a woman, you would learn how to weave or embroidery. You women and men in some cultures could learn how to draw or paint. There weren't a lot of women allowed to do this. You can make jewelry. Now all those kind of arts, like those kind of things that require the use of your hands, those were known as mechanical arts. And the other thing is, back then people thought the liberal arts, that when you did those, when you studied those, you were using your brain. But they thought, oh, well, mechanical arts, you're not using your brain. All you're using is your hand and your eyes. So here's the liberal arts: grammar, language, rhetoric, mathematics, geometry. I don't know why it's not included in mathematics, but it's not. Music and astronomy. And then the mechanical arts were like shoemaking, martial arts, including hunting, commerce, trade, tailoring, blah, 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 blah. And we get all the way down to architecture and art. For some reason, I have music here, and I have music here, but maybe it's a different kind of music. I don't know. So artists were considered manual labor, and art was one of those mechanical arts. And but then during the Renaissance, artists became really interested and required to have an understanding of mathematics, anatomy, optics, etc., etc. So now art gets pushed into the liberal arts category rather than being considered a manual art. And the other thing was there were certain artists that were so good at what they did, people started considering them geniuses. And where does that term genius come from? So like a genius it was like in, I believe it's a Latin term. And back then, back in the day, a couple of thousand years ago, people thought that people like poets and playwrights and philosophers had this little god called a genius or genii that would blow inspiration into your ear, and that's what helped you produce this like beautiful poetry or plays or whatever. So during but the other thing about geniuses, they thought all like these geniuses were a little bit crazy. So this concept of the artist as a genius, all a little bit nutty, came into play during the Renaissance. So by the way, let's see who we have. We have Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and who's the other Ninja Turtle? Donatello. That actually, this is Donatello, this is Raphael. Those were the four major geniuses of the Renaissance, even though there were some other people considered geniuses as well. So now we're going to talk about like how did those artists reproduce these big murals and these big paintings back then. So just like we were talking about earlier, like artists had to do preparatory sketches before they could move on to their paintings or their murals. So back then, during Leonardo and Michelangelo and all those guys' time, they would do on this giant piece of vellum, very expensive to make, they would do what's known as a cartone or cartoon. So this is a preparatory sketch drawn to scale on this heavy duty paper, which was vellum or parchment for, and these would be done for painting or a fresco. So like these artists, like, so a lot of times there's be competition. So the Pope would go, like, I want somebody to do a big mural in the Vatican. And then artists like Leonardo and Raphael and Donatello and Michelangelo would produce these giant cartoons, and then they would put them on display, and people would just go nuts wanting to see them. Like tons of people came to see the original drawing that Leonardo da Vinci did of the Madonna and Child with Saint Anne and the infant Saint John the Baptist. Now, this is a drawing by him. It's not the original. It's not the big giant one he did. But people were just like, this guy's a genius. And then at the same time, because all these artists they were starting to consider them genius, just like you consider me a genius, ha ha ha. They started wanting to collect their work. And these artists were able to make these incredible livings this way. So we talked about preparatory sketches. We'll talk about artists like drew to improve upon or invent. And so Leonardo da Vinci, a lot of times people thought he came up with these inventions, but we're finding out that other people invented them, but he improved upon them. And a lot of these inventions that he improved upon, there was not the, like the technical skill to make them come to fruition. So here's an airplane that Da Vinci designed. Here's a helicopter he designed. Here's a parachute. Leonardo actually got this guy to jump off a building using this parachute, and I think he broke a bunch of bones when he fell down. He invented tanks. He improved upon the crossbow, which people were using at that time. I just threw these in. I used to work at the American Visionary Art Museum, and a lot of the artists that we dealt with had mental health issues. And this is one of the artists who I found like his work in the library I worked in there. And this was a guy named Carl Hanyanki, and he invented all these flying machines and dirigibles. I love them. They're such beautiful drawings. So artists also draw to understand nature. So Leonardo da Vinci was going to do a painting of St. George and the dragon, and he was like, well, how does a dragon move since there aren't any? So he started looking at cats, like how cats moved, and then he translated this into these little dragon shapes that he's drawing. Then he like wanted to understand, how do plants grow? And then he like, back then, if a doctor was performing an autopsy, they would go like, come on, everybody. Come on, all you artists, come and look at this. So they'd let the artists hang out there while they're cutting somebody open. And Leonardo, like he loved doing this. And he did all these anatomical drawings. They're just lovely. They're beautiful. And he drew the first accurate portrait of the human spine. He wrote the first description of cirrhosis of the liver. He's the first person to like actually write down that the heart has 4 chambers. These are some other medical drawings, like you might be grossed out by them, but I really love them. They're like so beautiful and fascinating looking, by this guy named Gobard Bidloo. So then Leonardo da Vinci, he also drew to understand and record movement. So he was really interested in like how does fabric move around the arm, and like how does it crease and fold, and how do horses move? And we saw those pictures of those cats, like how do cats move, and how does water flow? And like he spent like days and days and days watching this water pour out of a drainage pipe. And then he's like, would look at like, this is like of a hurricane. So the next part is different medias of drawing. I'm not going to go into this. It's kind of boring, but I'm going to ask you to read the chapter because you're going to have to know about these different things. So the next video I'm going to produce to y'all is going to go over the instructions for the Principle of Design homework. Alrighty. Thank you, and talk to you soon.